In this session, Michael Martin discusses with Donald Davidson various problems in epistemology, with particular emphasis on perception. The program begins with Davidson's comments on the traditional justified true belief analyses of knowledge. He offers some reasons for why these have failed, and remarks that he shares Quine's attitude towards such analyses. Davidson believes that it's pointless to try to give a general account of justification, since we have different standards of justification for different beliefs. Martin follows up these comments by relating them to what Davidson has written in A Coherence Theory of Truth and Knowledge, and he asks Davidson to explain in what sense his current views are coherentist. Next, Martin presents John McDowell's criticism of Davidson's views about empirical knowledge, from McDowell's book, Mind and World. The criticism is mainly that Davidson's account of empirical knowledge leaves room for skepticism about the external world. Because we can imagine a brain in a vat, and according to Davidson it would be correct to interpret the brain's perceptual beliefs as being beliefs about its immediate electronic environment. However, the qualitative character of the brain's perceptual experiences are just the same as ours. So there's no reason to suppose that our perceptual beliefs are not beliefs about an electronic environment. A detailed discussion follows, but the central tenet of Davidson's response is that he does not understand the notion of qualitative character, qualia, or the what it's like to be notion. For a further consideration of related themes, see the discussions by John McDowell and by Stuart Hampshire. Davidson's refusal to understand the notion of qualitative character of experience stems from his general refusal to countenance an epistemic intermediary of any sort between the world and our beliefs about it. And Martin presses him for his reasons for this. Martin argues that one of the reasons why philosophers have felt there must be an epistemic intermediary is so that they can account for problems of illusion and hallucination in perception. And he invites Davidson to show how these problems can be dealt with without such an intermediary. The session ends with Davidson summarizing his views about what perceptual belief is and how it is justified. We take up the discussion now at the London School of Economics. I'm very pleased to welcome Michael Martin from University College London as discussant today with Professor Donald Davidson. In broad compass, Michael will discuss epistemology explicit and implicit in Davidson's work and Davidson's conception of perception. Michael.
Thank you, Rudy. Professor Davidson, I think for many philosophers, the central task of epistemology has been taken to be the analysis of knowledge. And they've taken that to be to see if they can explain knowledge in terms of truth, belief, and justification. What's your reaction to this project?
Well, I taught epistemology for years, and it seemed to me that there's a sense in which this project can't be carried out. The problem concerns the last feature, of course, as Plato discovered in the Theaetetus. The hard thing is to account for the conditions in which a belief is justified, or justified in just the right way to make it knowledge if it's true. And I guess I became convinced that it's not just that nobody has ever gotten it right, but that there are reasons in principle why there isn't any one right answer. It's not that we don't know a lot about justification in particular cases, but that there should be one account, which is the satisfactory one. Seems to me then, and seems to me now, very unlikely. So in this respect, I think I have the same attitude that Quine does, and that the attempt to give a general account of justification is actually a mistaken project, If we ask in particular cases, why do you believe this? The answer may or may not count as good enough to say, well, so if that turns out to be true, then he has knowledge. I think we have just many different standards for the notion of knowledge, and we can. I'm not against philosophers investigating this, and in fact, I'm not against philosophers trying to do what can't be done, because you learn a great deal from trying to do it. But I don't have this project myself. I mean, I don't have, and I'm not looking for a general analysis of the notion of knowledge in terms of truth, belief, and justification.
Good, thank you. Now, in your answer, you said you were skeptical of being able to give a general theory of justification. Does that extend to being skeptical of being able to give theories of, for instance, justification in relation to certain types of belief? For instance, there's distinctive justification for perceptual or observational beliefs, distinctive kinds of justification for testimonial belief, or distinctive kinds of justification associated with our logical or mathematical knowledge?
Yes, it does seem to me that to have any view of knowledge at all, empirical knowledge anyway, we need a reason to think that perception often yields knowledge. And I think a general account of why that is the case will fall short of giving us a strict criterion to say, in this case, perception gave somebody knowledge, but not in that case because it didn't give quite enough justification or something of that sort. But if one puts this in very general terms, it says, well, why does perception put us in touch with the way the world is? That I think we do have to explain.
Right. And so, does that explain how, in papers such as a coherence theory of truth and knowledge, when talking about empirical justification, you stop at the point of saying, well, we can show that, in the main, our beliefs have to be veridical,
Right.
and that answers the question of empirical justification, without going on to give an account of how, say, particularly observational beliefs are justified. That's not a topic that you raise.
If we had a clear way of distinguishing observational beliefs, then I'd say, no, that is something we should do. My trouble is that as soon as I try to arrive at anything that corresponds to, let's say, the positivist views or empiricisms generally about what counts as an observational belief, I find it very hard to find what the boundary is.
Right. So, would you say that your skepticism about the possibility of being successful in giving an account of theory of justification relates to holism?
Yes, it is related to that. In perception, we're caused to believe things about the world, and some of these things are fairly simple. Some of them are very complex in the sense that we wouldn't be led to believe that if we didn't have a host of other beliefs. And I don't see any direct route to picking out some that are really direct. I mean, I see ways of contrasting some cases with others. A person who says there goes an electron when he's looking into a cloud chamber needs a lot of background, but nevertheless it's an observation. He just looks and believes, but he wouldn't believe that if he hadn't learned a lot of physics. Then there are simpler cases where somebody looks and says, that's green. And I do suppose that in our lives, we learn the latter sort before we learn the sort about electrons. But I would give up on trying to give a strict story, because I think different people begin in different places. So there isn't one general account.
Good. Well, I want to come back to the question of perception later. Mm-hmm. But at this moment, I think it might be interesting if we move from that to consider some of the things that either you have said or some people have taken you to say about questions of justification in some of your work. For instance, in a coherence theory of truth and knowledge, you suggested that we should adopt a coherence theory of truth, and that a coherence theory of knowledge should follow naturally from that. In an afterword to a coherence theory of truth and knowledge, some 4 years later, you took back the description of your view as being a coherence theory. And in the context, it seemed to be that you were taking back the claim that it was a coherence theory of truth. So the question that I want to ask you is, where does that leave the description of your view as a coherence theory of knowledge?
Yes. I'm afraid that I have several times in my writings used words that are often thrown around in philosophy, like coherence, correspondence, and so forth, and then regretted it. And it's the terms I regretted, not my views. Well, in some cases, of course, I have regretted my views also. But in the case of the coherence theory, people associate coherence theories with a kind of idealism, where one supposes that we just are stuck with a vast number of ideas, beliefs, and as long as they stick together, that's our world, and there's no control from the outside. That's certainly not my view, and so I shouldn't have used the word. Though I did explain what I meant by it, which was just a negative thing, and that is, nothing counts as a reason for believing something except another belief. That seems to me still to be right. And that's all I meant by a coherence theory.
Right, good. I think that's very clear. It would be interesting just to pursue the point a bit further, even though I suspect that you'll come back and say that the complaint misunderstands your original view. In recent lectures, John McDowell, in Mind and World, complains in precisely the way that you were just talking of, that your view seems to cut us off from the world. He puts it so, he says, suppose one feels the worry in this familiar form. So far as the picture goes, one might be a brain in a mad scientist's vat. The Davidsonian response seems to be that if one were a brain in a vat, it would be correct to interpret one's belief as being largely true beliefs about the brain's electronic environment. But is that the reassurance we need if we are to be immunized against the attractions of the given? The response to the brain in a vat worry works the wrong way round. The response does not calm the fear that our picture leaves our thinking possibly out of touch with the world outside us. It just gives us a dizzying sense that our grip on what it is that we believe is not as firm as we thought. So he seems to still think to your position where you haven't got us in enough contact with the world outside of our beliefs.
Yes. Well, among my many regrets, I regret any serious philosophy that depends upon science fiction examples because they're never described in enough detail and can't be.
Right.
To draw any solid conclusions. I think I've mentioned that I was sorry I ever introduced an omniscient interpreter. It's a piece of science fiction that you don't really know how to cash out. And there's the notorious swamp man. I'd say talk about the brain in the vat is in the same category because the example is never described in enough detail to draw any conclusions from it. And I think perhaps I'm more convinced of that now than I ever was. I think a much better way to go about it would be to say how it is that perception does put us in touch with the world. And then if you want to talk about the brain in the vat, you have to say, if the brain in the vat can do all that, then the brain in the vat is as much in touch with his part of the world as we are with our world. The brain in the vat would just be a person who had a very rather small world, but only in the perfectly ordinary sense in which somebody who lived in one room all their lives and never could get outside would have a very limited number of things they could talk about, but you wouldn't say that they didn't have thoughts, and it would be possible for them to talk to you and you could talk to them and to exchange views. If the brain in the vat can do all that, then it's okay. But I think the better approach is to ask what is required in order to have thoughts that have a content. And when you've said that, then you can say, now, if the brain in the vat's got all that, he's all right too. And no reason to be a skeptic about him.
Good. So, is this right? The sticking point between the worry as McDowell expresses it and your response to it is that McDowell assumes that we can make perfectly good sense of it striking the brain in the vat as if it's just in the world in the way that we are, when in fact the brain in the vat isn't in such a world. And if we take your route, all its thoughts can be about are events in the vat. And we don't think our world is that way. That's McDowell's worry. And you say we can't really make sense of it striking the brain in the vat as if it's in a world like ours.
Yes, I think the question whether what the brain in the vat is thinking about is events in the machine that it's attached to, or are about things outside. That depends upon a lot of details, and I don't think those details are terribly hard to get at. What lies behind what I'm saying is partly this. I think being in communication with other minds is a condition for having thoughts. So the brain in the vat has got to be in contact with other minds. And this contact can only be established by their sharing a picture of a world that they're both in. Now, my guess is we can't really tell a story in which what is being shared by minds outside and the brain in the vat is just little things tinkling inside the vat. I think it's going to require that. Well, for one thing, I think the brain in the vat has got to know that there are people out there. And if we supply it with sense organs and so forth, then it can do that. But I think it was a mistake, which I think I see how I was led into it, to suppose that it's practical to think that all that the brain in the vat is sharing with minds outside is things in the vat. Because I think if the brain in the vat doesn't know that there are people out there in a common space, then it probably isn't thinking anything at all.
Right. That's a very nice answer. But now, I can imagine many people's response to that, although it's not one I myself would endorse. Mm-hmm. They would say that they can perfectly well imagine the life of a brain in a vat who's cut off from contact with other people. And you may say, well then, the brain in the vat can't have thoughts. But they would still insist that the brain in the vat has an inner life, they would say, or a subjective aspect to their life, namely what it's like for the brain to be so. And that they can perfectly well imagine that it could be the way it is for them now on the inside, if they were a brain in the vat, even if you were to say that in that situation, if they were cut off from contact with all other people, that they couldn't have thoughts.
Well, this is where some people have a better imagination than I do, because I don't think I have any idea what it would be like to have no thoughts. I mean, I'm a creature that has thoughts. And what am I asking myself? If I had the concept, which I don't have, of a raw given, a sort of sensory intake. Well, here I guess we're imagining no sensory intake even, just things going on in this brain. But what? What's going on in it? See, I don't make any clear sense of the question, what is it like to be a bat? And it seems to me this is very much like the question about what is it like to be a brain in the vat without any intake from the outside world at all. The bat's a little better off, actually, than the brain in the vat. Bats are better than bats because at least they have sense organs and can navigate in the same world that I do, though in somewhat different ways. But what is it like to be a bat? I think we don't know what we're asking when we say that.
Fine, good. That's very clear. Now, a point you made in passing there, I think, leads us on to the next question, which is you mentioned the idea of a raw sensory given and that you rejected. And so that relates to, in calling your view a coherence view, I take it that part of your intention was to reject any form of foundationalism in knowledge. And you associated foundationalism with the thought that there is a raw sensory given, which is non-propositional and non-belief-like in nature, but which grounds belief.
Right. No, that's absolutely right. Because foundationalism, as well, we'll just say this is, I've decided to speak this way, is the hunt for something that justifies beliefs, but which has no propositional content itself. And that seems to me to be a contradiction. A reason for believing something has to have some logical relation with what it's a reason for. And propositions, or things that have propositional content, like beliefs, are the only things that can stand in logical relations to beliefs. So I think the hunt for an epistemic level which supplies us with reasons for believing things about the world, but which is not itself, which itself has no propositional contents, just seems to me to be a hopeless enterprise from the beginning.
Fine. Now, some people want to hold on to an idea of something that's not belief-like,
Yes.
but is nevertheless a sensory state, and may or may not be conceptual, but is taken to be about the world around one, and in virtue of that, justifies one's beliefs.
It's just unclear to me how a state can be about the world and not have a propositional content. But what does the about mean here?
Well, for instance, Christopher Peacock, who advocates the idea that there is a non-conceptual content to perceptual states, will say that these states have correctness conditions. There is a way the world would have to be in order for your experience to be veridical. And if the world is not that way, then one's experience is illusory. And that experience stands in a justificatory relation to some of your beliefs. For instance, if it looks to you as if there are 3 glasses of water on the table, then in order for that experience to be correct, there must indeed be 3 glasses on the table. And the reason why your belief that there are 3 glasses on the table is justified is because it does look to you as if there are 3 glasses on the table.
Well, I think there's a step in that I neither understand nor do I see the need for introducing such a step. And that is the idea of an epistemic intermediary between the world on the one hand and what I believe about the world on the other hand. It seems to me that as soon as one tries to introduce such an intermediary, this intermediary has to be something that's not a belief, doesn't have a propositional content, but neither is it the world itself. We're on the road. Well, first of all, we have to explain that, I think, in great detail. And if we start talking about this intermediary being true or false, we're already talking as if it had a propositional content, and using a different word like correct or something like that doesn't seem to me to be any help. If all we have to go on in our knowledge of the world is some kind of representations, and then I think we're back essentially to various old-fashioned forms of empiricism with their obvious problems, namely that they lead to skepticism, because things might seem to be a certain way, and if you ask, but how do I know that they're really the way they seem to be, you have no answer. Or you can only say, well, I take some other seemings in, and if they all fit together, that's the best I can do. That's coherentism with a vengeance, I would say. See, the important question isn't what happens in perception. I'm willing to talk about that. We haven't really been talking about it. The question just is, can we make use of a level of something that's epistemologically essential between the world on the one hand and what we think about it on the other hand. I don't think we can. So if I'm going to give an account of perception, I'm going to talk about the world on the one hand, the causal role of our sense organs, and what we are caused to believe by that. But there's nothing in between.
Right.
There's no intermediary that's bringing the message to us. We're justified in believing what we're caused to believe in a great many cases. And that's not because there's something that provides the justification. It's because that kind of belief is related to the world in such a way that it's mostly going to be right. And now I haven't tried to say why, because you haven't asked me, but wait, we need a story about that.
Good. Now, the way in which you dealt with the question of whether there was an intermediary, that was whether, from our theory of knowledge, we needed to posit something with an epistemological role that intervened between the world and belief. For many philosophers today, the reason that they appeal to an intermediary state is not primarily from a concern to be foundationless within epistemology, but because they think, from giving an account of the perceptual process, they need to posit an intermediary state. And then from that it will then follow that it has a more than a causal role in the story of how we move from world to justified belief about the world. So that takes us back to a question you raised earlier about what need there was for thinking that there was an intermediary state. And I think at this stage we can distinguish two questions. There's a question whether there could be a state that wasn't a belief state, but may still be propositional. And then a further question, whether if there is such an intermediary, we can make sense of that state, playing a justificatory role, and yet not being propositional. It's whether we can make sense of the idea of non-conceptual content.
Right.
Now, many philosophers have thought that the reason we need to introduce a state which is not a state of belief, even if it's a propositional state, is by reflection on cases of so-called disbelief in perception. For instance, if now it was to look to you or to me as if 5 pink elephants had just entered the room and were doing a can-can before us, it's quite likely that we'd both be suspicious of the circumstance. We might even suspect that there'd been something in the coffee, and we'd disbelieve our eyes. In that case, it would look to us as if there were 5 pink elephants doing the can-can before us, but we wouldn't believe that there were 5 such elephants. And so philosophers have wanted to suggest that there is a state. It's looking to one as if there are 5 pink elephants in front of one, which is distinct from coming to believe that there are 5 pink elephants.
Well, I think there's a distinction to be made there. I might say the phrase "looks to be" seems to me a weasel phrase, because I think under normal circumstances you would take that to imply that the person believes it. Or I take it in that seems to me a rather awkward way of saying, well, actually, if I take it in that, I would say, I not only believe it, but it's the case. So I'm suspicious about these phrases which don't really have a clear role in our ordinary talk, as if they were giving us an insight into something very special that's happening. I think we very often are in a position to say, it looks as if so-and-so, but it isn't. There I'm expressing 2 different beliefs. One is that it's a certain way, and the other one is, but it doesn't look that way. And those are two just ordinary beliefs, both of which are often prompted by looking and listening and making contact with the world. But I don't see the need for a further state of mind besides how it looks and how I take it to be. I think just by looking, I may come to both of those things. There are these well-known illusions where I look, this line looks longer than that one, but I'm not led to believe that it is by looking because I know better. I've measured the lines I know already. I'm comparing it with other beliefs I have, of course, background beliefs of various kinds. And I think we are often, at a first glance, led to, that is, caused to, believe something which we almost instantly cancel out because it doesn't fit in with what we see next, or it doesn't fit in with other things that come to mind that we know about the world and so forth. So other beliefs are constantly feeding in. Nothing we're led to believe while looking is something that we would have been led to believe if we had no other beliefs. The empty mind doesn't suddenly come upon a belief. Our beliefs are in a massive context of other beliefs. And that's where what I used to call the coherence element, or which you more properly call the holism of the mental, comes in. So perception takes place within a very complex structure. It isn't something simple that you can pick out all by itself.
I take it your opponent would grant that, but still wish to hold that there's a distinctive mental state, which is the appearance state, which is doing work, even if that state would only be present and only do the work that it does, against a background of a whole lot of beliefs about the world. And so I want to come back to a phrase you used at one point. You said, for instance, in the case when you look at a Muller-Lyer illusion or a Ponzo illusion,
right?
You say, well, there's how it looks, and then there's the belief that you form. You form a belief about how it looks. Now, the initial phrase, how the thing looks, do you take that itself just to be an aspect of the world?
Well, I think we can easily distinguish between, in some cases, how it looks to me and how it looks. If I say that's how it looks, that's how it looks to other people too. It's an objective feature of certain kinds of illusions that everybody's going to say this line looks longer than that. So that's how it looks. And that's a perfectly good belief that I'm led to by looking. How it looks to me is the case where that's the appearance that I get. It looks that way to me, but it might not look that way to other people. Yes, it's worth distinguishing between statements about how things look, which implies normally that they would look that way to almost everybody, and statements about how they look to me, where I'm emphasizing the fact that they might not look that way to somebody else, but they look that way to me, maybe because I have tinted glasses on, or because I know I'm colorblind, or whatever it might be. But all of these seem to me to be beliefs of mine, which I'm caused to have under the circumstances and because of a lot of knowledge I have by using my eyes.
Good. But now, the examples that you've just been talking about are examples often of cases of illusion, either cases where something appears other than it is to everyone, or at least it appears other than it is to me. But we can also talk about cases of what philosophers often call hallucination, cases in which it certainly looks to me as if something is before me, but there isn't anything that I'm seeing in that case. Now, I take it in that case, when I believe that it looks to me as if things are thus and so, the belief does not concern any aspect of the world in front of me, as it stands. It's not, in the case of the Muller-Lyer illusion, when you say, well, the diagram looks as if the lines are unequal, there your belief is about the diagram in front of you. When I say, well, it looks to me as if the third pink elephant isn't keeping time, there isn't any pink elephant about which I believe that it's not keeping time.
Yes. This is a case, though, where I have no false belief, is that?
That's right.
I have no false belief, all right. No, of course, but I can still report that I have the impression or the illusion, let's say, if I'm not deceived, I have the illusion. I can report that, and of course I have the illusion that there's an elephant there. Not a very typical case, but
Far from typical.
but possible. Yes, and I can report this, of course, like anything else.
But you don't want to take that report to be a report of a state of mind, the appearance of there being
Well,
pink elephant.
we should distinguish, I think, between what I'm saying, if I say something looks a certain way, and saying it looks that way to me. Because in the former case, I imply that anybody with normal eyesight would be apt to see it that way. Whereas in the latter case, I'm singling myself out as, well, it looks that way to me because my glasses are tinted, or it looks to me that way because I'm colorblind, or it sounds that way to me because my right ear isn't very good on the high frequencies. And there are many such cases where we're aware of why things sound or look the way they do to us, but perhaps not to others. But all of that seems to me not to introduce any epistemic intermediary. See, I'm not denying that it makes sense to say there's a way it looks to me. I'm just denying that the look is somehow standing between me and the world, as if it plays some role of justification. I'm still eliminating that middle step because I think it has always led to trouble, and in fact, we don't need it. I mean, as epistemologists, it doesn't do us any good to try to find something in there to provide the messenger that brings the word in from the outside world.
Good. Now, I would agree with you that if we're talking about the look of an object, we certainly don't want the look of an object to be an intermediary between us and the world. The look of an object is, as you eloquently put it, an objective feature of it that other people can check whether it really does look that way or not. But in certain unusual cases, we can certainly report how things look to us, but we have no expectation that there is anything there which is looking one way or another. For instance, if it does now look to us as if there are 5 pink elephants doing the can-can, then I can report that it looks to me as if the third from the left is out of time. And if I'm perfectly well aware I'm suffering an hallucination, there's no expectation on my part that there is something there, an elephant, which looks as if it's out of time. And I think it's there that philosophers have thought that such judgments as that are a report about a state of mind, an appearance state, which is itself not a part of the world that we normally form beliefs about, nor is it the belief itself. It's certainly not the belief that the elephants are there, I don't believe it. Nor is it merely the belief that that's how things look to me. For that belief they take to be the report of this other state. Now, do you want to deny that in that situation, when I believe it looks to me as if the third elephant from the left is out of time, that that is a report of an appearance or an impression?
Well, I'd rather say, and of course, we assume there are such states of mind. I think it would be better just to say, it is something about the world I'm reporting, but part of the world happens to be in me. And I can, by what's happening in my mind, causes me to believe I'm having an illusion of a certain sort, and I could report that. That's a perfectly ordinary belief, though it's not a belief about the outside world. It's not a belief about elephants. It's a belief about some kind of hallucination or illusion which I'm having.
But now, if, for instance, it had looked to us as if two members of the public had strayed in to the room and sat down, in that situation we would not have been inclined to disbelieve our senses. We might have been affronted at the interruption, but we'd have thought it a quite possible event to have occurred. So the fact that it looked one way to us, that there were 5 pink elephants dancing the can-can, rather than looking another way, that there were just 2 members of the public straying in, makes a difference to what we come to believe, whether we trust our senses and believe that there are certain things in the world around us, or suspend judgment and instead form a belief about a state of our brain, as you said, which is a part of the world. So there it looks as if our description of how things look, and where we do use a proposition, is in turn explaining something about what we believe.
All right.
Well, and then the next move would then be to say that, but in explaining our belief, doesn't it also give a reason why you formed the one belief rather than the other?
Well, there are many possible ways to explain that depending upon the case, it seems to me. Presumably, the illusion, what is the illusion exactly? That I'm seeing elephants. I don't think I would, if I knew I wasn't seeing any elephants, it was perfectly clear that I wasn't, I doubt that I would say, it seems to me that there are some elephants, or it appears to me that there's some elephants, even though there aren't. I don't think those would be natural ways of expressing the situation. That's why I keep coming back to, I have the illusion that, that is actually a state of mind that's a little hard to describe, it seems to me. Not because I'm reluctant to talk about appearances and so forth, but because it's not an easy state of mind to imagine. I'm looking there and I really see. Are my eyes open? I ask these questions only because I want to know how I should describe what's going on. It's not that I'm in doubt that there are perfectly good ways, depending upon the story you tell me. But what's the difficulty? Since I can describe this perfectly well without supposing there's something called the appearance, which somehow justifies the belief, even though the belief in this case is not that there are some elements, but just simply that looks like there's some elements. If I don't take that step, then I don't see why I am pushed into the position of supposing that in ordinary cases there's an appearance which I'm depending upon in order to explain the belief I've arrived at, that there's a table there.
Right. Well, there are, I think, two things to say. I mean, the first is in filling out the case a bit more, and I think you're quite right that we need to push for more and more details. Mm-hmm. The case that I was trying to sketch in very, very brief outline was the thought that maybe there can be examples where one disbelieves one's senses just because, however vivid appearances are, it's just too incredible for things to be so.
Sure.
So it's as vivid and detailed as you like, but you withhold affirmation of things being so. And the suggestion, I take it, of the view that wishes to introduce appearances is not the view that what you ought to be doing, either in that case or in the case where you trust your senses, is first coming to believe, there's an appearance here. If there's an appearance, then I have reason to have a certain belief. But rather that there is an apparent state, and in virtue of having an apparent state, one comes to have the beliefs that one does. And the apparent state is part of the explanation of the belief, in a way that also gives a reason for the belief. And in this case, why one would think reasons were involved would be to say, well, it's precisely because how things look is so incredible that you refuse to trust your senses. If things hadn't looked quite so incredible, then you'd have been happy to swallow appearances.
Yes, all those things can happen. Sometimes you are actually caused to believe something very strange, but you revise it very quickly because you say, well, of course it couldn't be that way. Or what you see the next moment just doesn't fit with that. Something flashed before your mind, maybe that caused you to believe something. Now, our perceptual beliefs, as I call them, which are just beliefs that you are directly caused to have through your senses. But as I say, these can be very complex, and all of them are conditioned by all of the other beliefs you have. These perceptual beliefs come in various varieties in the sense that sometimes what you see makes you wonder what to believe. And you say, could that actually be my old friend? Oh, no, he's dead. But for a moment it passes through your mind. All sorts of complex things happen. But the appearance state, I'm not particularly eager to deny that there are such states. What I am eager to deny is that they can be usefully called on to serve an epistemic service, namely justifying what we come to believe. I mean, of course, it's a kind of justification for a perceptual belief to say, I saw it with my own eyes. But that's another belief.
Right. But then the question is whether the belief that I saw it with my own eyes is what's being cited as the justification, or rather the fact that I saw it with my own eyes is supposed to give the answer to why one believed what one did.
Yes. the fact that you saw it with your own eyes would be a reason for you to think that what I reported was true. But the fact that I saw it with my own eyes is not a justification for what I believe. I wouldn't offer that, because that would just be going in a circle. No, it's a justification to say I saw it with my own eyes, in the sense that you might not know that that's why I believe it. And maybe I was told it, maybe I just guessed it, and so forth. Now you know something about the root.
So, one variant of the view that says that there is an apparent state that one is reporting on, one says, well, this is how it looks to me, would be to say that what's reported on here is a non-belief state that is nevertheless propositional,
Right.
and that is an experience state. And because it's propositional, although not belief, it can stand in the kind of justificatory relation that you demand, since its propositional content will have a possible logical relation to the perceptual belief that resides.
Yes. This is the suggestion that I'm familiar with from John McDowell's book, which we mentioned at the beginning. This certainly, if we understood it, gets around the difficulty of an intermediary that doesn't have a propositional content. So the relation of justification makes sense. Of course, this is an epistemic intermediary between the world and what I believe it to be, because this proposition that I take in from the world may or may not lead me to believe that things are that way. And I have two objections, one of which would be enough. One is, this seems to be a propositional attitude that we don't have a word for, and that has suddenly entered the realm of discussion. I mean, we've always known about beliefs, doubts, hopes, intentions, meanings, and so on. And here all of a sudden we have a new propositional attitude which performs this vital role in empirical knowledge. And I'm afraid I don't see what it could be. If I take in that things are a certain way, I believe they're that way. That's how I understand those words. And I don't identify anywhere in my experience this taking in of a content without doing something with it. I mean, taking some attitude toward it. It might be that of wondering whether things are a certain way, or it might be that of it looking a certain way to me, which again is a belief. But if I just took in a proposition, say, well, okay, so what? I mean, why should I believe it? I don't know. So the first one is just a difficulty in understanding what this is. The second one is I don't see that it helps in understanding perception or knowledge. I think it hurts because it introduces something in between me and the world. And if all of my empirical knowledge is based upon these intermediaries, then I think an old-fashioned kind of skepticism applies. How do I know that's the way it is? And maybe all of them are misleading me. I have no way to go behind them and see whether the world really is the way these propositional contents are. So I would look for some more direct account of the connection between the world and my perceptual beliefs.
Right. Well, that seems to raise a further question. The accounts that we've been talking about and that you've been resisting all strive to give an account of what perceptual belief is and why such beliefs are justified. Right. Since you wish to reject those accounts, that leaves us with the question, how do you explain perceptual belief and how it is justified?
Yes, that certainly is the question that I must answer if I'm going to reject all of these other accounts. I think the answer is basically very simple. In application, it's very complex. The simple way to state it is this. There are some beliefs, or the sentences that express them, the content of which is given by their origin. Let's think of it in terms of sentences first, and then we can transfer it, I think, to the states of belief that those sentences express. We must learn some of our earliest sentences in situations of ostensive learning. People say, that's green in the presence of green objects. And we learn to say that's green, or at least we learn to say something systematically in the presence of green objects. Green objects do actually naturally look alike to us in a relevant respect. If they didn't, we wouldn't learn. So the contents of those sentences are given to them by the situations in which we learn them. It's not as though there's some content that comes from nowhere or that's lying in what we call the language. These sentences are being given whatever content they have by these learning situations. Chomsky has emphasized that sometimes you don't need a lot of repeating. I mean, it doesn't have to be a heavy form of induction. People often pick these things up very fast, and that's because the things that we pick up first are the things that we're geared to. They match the directions in which we naturally generalize. We find some things alike without being trained to do it. And so we pick up these basic perceptual sentences in these situations which give them their content. Now, it doesn't make any sense to say for the person who has learned this kind of sentence, that's green. It doesn't make any sense to say of them, maybe that sentence doesn't apply to the things that the people are applying it to, because there's no other route to describing the content of that than situations in which they have learned to use it. Now, I'd say the same goes for the concepts or beliefs that we express by using these sentences. They come by their content in the simplest cases from the actual causal situations in which the beliefs have been formed, in which the meanings of the sentences have been learned. So there's ostensive learning or ostensive conditioning because maybe the word learning is too strong, ostensive acquisition of meanings and contents is geared to the world from the start. And so we don't need to talk about the details of perception, what is given in experience and so forth. Whatever that may be, it doesn't interfere with the simple story that I'm telling, which doesn't require us to talk about appearances, takings in of propositional contents and so forth. It explains how the simplest empirical statements or beliefs have the content they do, and that's geared to the external world right from the beginning. Now, I mean, there's much more to this story, needless to say, but that's the beginning of it, and it's the type of account that I would give, which I don't think is unique to me at all. In fact, I think you find this idea in Wittgenstein, for example, and it's a form of externalism. That is, it's saying the contents of my simplest perceptual beliefs and sentences doesn't just depend upon something that's in my head. It also depends upon the history of the acquisition, which brings it in, identifies the contents of these beliefs and sentences in terms of relations to the external world.